Hey, everybody. So I'm talking today to Douglas Murray, who just wrote this book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the future of civilization. That's this. We basically walk through the book chapter by chapter. It's a relatively short book, although it doesn't lack in intensity. What happened October 7th when Hamas invaded Israel? What I saw, Douglas's account of his sojourn through Israel in the aftermath of the catastrophe, how the world turned. We discussed the protests primarily originating on university campuses, much to their eternal shame. The disconnect, the fact that the propaganda exercise and what would you say, the zeitgeist of the West was such so that Israel was demonized almost immediately after the attack for daring to defend itself. And then Douglas's conclusion, from defeat into victory. And well, that's where the conversation got a little bit more theological, possibly, an inevitability when talking about the existence of good and evil. We discussed Douglas's observations that the Israelis have been very successful at pushing forward a truly pro-life, pro-abundance ethos, and the consequence for their thriving, for their resilience in the face of really insuperable opposition, and the meaning of that for hope, not only in Israel, but in the West in general, and a hope we most desperately need in these strangest of all times. Join us for that. So, Mr. Murray, I read your book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Yeah, it's a pretty rough read in like 5 different dimensions. It's brutal and unnerving and like terribly relevant, and not merely because of the situation in Israel. So I think what we should do first is I'm going to ask you questions about each chapter. It's a short book. There's 5 chapters. It starts with what happened. And there's questions everyone has. How did the Israeli security forces miss this? How could something like this happen? What did happen? Who was responsible? So let's start by laying that out. What happened on October 7th?
What happened was that about 4,000 or more terrorists invaded Israel in the early morning. The Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other jihadist groups in Gaza started firing hundreds and hundreds of rockets at about 6:30 in the morning, almost exactly 6:30 in the morning. So air raid sirens went off across the country. But then something, and sadly that's kind of usual in Israel. It's quite common to have air raid sirens, particularly in the south, has been for 20 years. What became clear was very unusual was that across multiple parts of the Gaza-Israel border, thousands of terrorists broke in. They broke down the fences, they went to the checkpoints where Gazan workers would come through each day and where aid lorries and indeed commerce occurred. They went to those crossings as well, attacked the soldiers, overwhelmed them in quite a lot of places. It was a religious holiday. It's the holiday of Simchat Torah, and so a lot of people were at home with their families. It was 50 years to the day since the Yom Kippur War, when Israel's Arab neighbors invaded in a surprise attack as well. So you might say, well, how come it's a surprise? That was one of the things, as soon as I got to Israel straight after the 7th, one of the things I was trying to find out was what the hell went wrong. Because the Israelis have always had, certainly since 1973, a sort of invulnerability. It's not true, of course, but they were seen to be invulnerable by many of their neighbors. Certainly
impossible to catch by surprise.
Impossible to catch by surprise. It's what I call the Fowlerization of Israel, the sort of idea that it's the eyes in the sky everywhere, nothing that can be done that could surprise them. And that wasn't the case. Massive amounts of the security apparatus of Israel failed. Hamas were also very, very clever. They'd done a lot of reconnaissance, using, sadly, Gazan workers in Israel to do the reconnaissance, it has to be said, in the months and years ahead of the 7th. They knew how to take down things like communications. They knew how to take down the security apparatus at the border. And by the time that hundreds and then thousands of people were flooding into Israel, invading, they were going community by community through the south, village by village. They're called kibbutz. They're small communities of sometimes a few hundred, sometimes 1,000 people. And these were peaceful communities, farming communities. And they started to go house by house through these communities, massacring the people inside, kidnapping as well. They came across, of course, because they managed to do the invasion not just by land, but by sea and also by air in hang gliders. They managed to come into the dance party, the Nova Party, where thousands of young people were dancing in the early morning. And there's a debate about whether or not the terrorists knew that they were going to get this really easy pickings of unarmed young people dancing in the morning. But whether it was luck or design, they managed to get to the party and came in on military jeeps and trucks and motorcycles and started massacring their way through the young people in the early hours of the morning. There were a lot of questions I asked about what went wrong on the Israeli side. And there's a lot to find out about, and some of the answers I think I've come to. But although many people in their homes who I spoke to in the hospitals and in the communities in the aftermath of the 7th said the same thing to me, the thing they said was that they'd told their children as they were hiding in the bomb shelters, as their homes were on fire and they could hear people at the door trying to break in. They said that they'd told their children, don't worry, the army will be here in moments. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't. But it didn't fail entirely. There were some army in the area who put up a very good fight. And some of the army managed to get down fast. Some elite units managed to get to the south swiftly, had very, very intense firefights. But one of the other things that happened was that there were a lot of people who I described, Arab, Druze, Jews, Israelis, who were what I call self-starters, just people who realized that everything was going wrong. The country had been invaded. It was war. And who, through some extraordinary mettle or insight or whatever, sometimes just information, somebody who happened to know somebody in one of the communities in the south who was saying, we're on fire, would just hurtle to the scene and save lives. And that's why I say that the morning of the 7th was a story of catastrophic evil from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and indeed the Gazan civilians who came in to join in the raping and the stealing and the kidnapping. By the end of the day, 1,200 Israelis were dead, many, many more injured, and 250 taken hostage into Gaza. By proportion of population, if people were to extrapolate that out to America, it would be about 44,000 Americans killed in one day.
Well, the hostage situation is also...
And 10,000 Americans taken hostage.
Right.
That's by proportion of population, if you extrapolate it out. It would be 10,000 Americans being dragged out of their homes and taken into enemy territory by terrorists. But the story was, first of all, of the evils that Hamas committed that day. Secondly, and the suffering that they imposed. Secondly, of course, the failure of much of the security apparatus in Israel, from which lessons will have to be learned, and not just by Israel, but by her allies. But thirdly, as I say, it's also the story of extraordinary people rising to this terrible moment and doing unbelievably heroic things. I tell a lot of the stories of people, for instance, there's somebody who's become a friend called Nimrod who hurtled south in his car. He had been in the army, was called back to base by his commander, but by that point Nimrod was driving south and he managed to pick up a gun on the way, a single revolver with, I think, 8 rounds of ammunition. Went through every military checkpoint and just, he said he didn't see a live Israeli till the early afternoon. But when he did, he fought and killed many terrorists. There are other people, like there was a young man at the party I mentioned in the book, whose girlfriend I met, who had realized the situation, managed to get a car out of the party. The terrorists were massacring everyone as they came out by car. So they were shooting the cars, so then there was a log jam. But this young man managed to find a way out on another route. And he took 4 or 5 young people in the car, drove them 30 minutes, dropped them off, came back, took another car full of young people, drove again, took them back. Every time they said to him, don't go back again, it's hell, it's death. But he kept doing it. And then the last time he did it, he was killed. But there are lots of terrible stories from the day that I recount. But as I say, it also seems to me to be important to credit the people who survived and who didn't, who showed unbelievable heroism.
It didn't really surprise me, I suppose, that there were security lapses. I mean, if you're dealing with an enemy that's absolutely committed, the probability that over some long span of time, they're going to find a way through your defenses.
Yeah.
How is that not 100% if everything isn't locked down and there's any semblance of freedom whatsoever?
Yeah.
So the explanation you offered about the mythical status of Israeli invulnerability seems to me to be the most effective explanation.
That and one other thing, which was what was known as the conception, which I spoke about with military and other political leaders. It's a very interesting thing, this. The conception was effectively, it was obviously a terrible mistake, but was a belief in some of the security infrastructure in Israel, that Hamas were effectively like so many terrorist and radical movements throughout history, that they had been misgoverning the Gaza effectively since Israel withdrew in 2005, but they'd stolen billions of dollars of international aid.
Yeah.
All the leaders of Hamas were billionaires, thanks to the Canadian, American, European, British
bully
taxpayers.
for us, seriously.
Well done for us.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Great use of our
Really quite something.
Taxpayer funds. The billions of dollars that went into Gaza were largely used by Hamas leaders to enrich themselves, to build an incredibly elaborate terrorist infrastructure throughout Gaza, miles and miles of underground tunnels, very, very elaborate systems, some effectively crawl spaces, others large enough to drive military vehicles from one end of Gaza to the other. And they built that whole infrastructure over the 18 years or so that they governed Gaza. And that was the other way in which they used their money. But the conception, which turned out to be a misconception, was that part of the security apparatus in Israel believed that Hamas leadership were happy with just being corrupt. Mm-hmm. They were living in luxury, penthouses.
Corrupt was sufficient malevolence.
Corrupt was sufficient. Rather like the Soviet Union and by the 80s. The leaders didn't believe it anymore. They just wanted to drink and have whatever they could in the time they had.
Right.
And
hedonistic materialism trumps fanatical malevolence.
And of course,
that's quite the theory.
Yeah, and many times in history that has turned out to be true. A lot of revolutionary movements have done that. But this turned out to be completely wrong in the case of the Hamas leadership. They wanted to enrich themselves, and they wanted to do what they said they were going to do, which was to annihilate the Jews. And if you look...
Why not have both?
They managed to try to have both. But if you look at, for instance, one of the central figures of the book, Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, one of the leaders of Hamas, who'd been in an Israeli jail until 2011 for killing Palestinians with his own hands, literally throttling them with his own hands and with a kafir.
He was the one who had such a remarkable obituary in the New York Times, if I remember correctly.
One of many. Yahya Sinwar was a true psychopath. Mm-hmm. And I'd known about him for years. A lot of people who studied the region had. He was what would have been called a true believer. After he'd been released in a prisoner exchange for one Israeli soldier who they'd kidnapped in the late 2000s, after Sinwar was exchanged, and by the way, having had his life saved by an Israeli doctor in prison, Sinwar went back to Gaza, seized back control of Hamas, said repeatedly in public statements that he wanted Hamas to go into Israel and tear the hearts out of the bodies of the Jews. On the 7th, he took his best shot at it. And it turned out that what Sinwar said he wanted to do, he did.
There is nothing you'll do in life that's more challenging, difficult, and rewarding than being a parent. Nothing with greater highs or lower lows. You have little kids for a very short period of time. It is a major mistake not to notice that and not to appreciate it.
We're dealing with a pattern of misbehaviors with our son, who's 3 years old. Whenever we want to leave the house, he starts running away.
We have to be places at certain times.
When a disciplinary issue arises, you need to make space to master it. I have to not do what I thought I was going to do for 10 minutes to set this right.
Our 13-year-old throws tantrums quite often when he doesn't get his way. We spoiled the heck out of him.
When you spoil a child, so to speak, you take away from them the opportunity to develop their own competence by doing too many things for them. The